The first confusion to clear up is I've considered 9 disability income systems in Canada that, as Ellen said, and I'll put it in different words, they're like 9 cats in a bag. If you're trying to think back to her slide, she also included another set of income, disability income, which included the auto insurance and pain and suffering type awards. So you could actually say that there are 10 disability income systems in Canada. I tried to venture into the misty nether world of auto insurance, trying to figure out exactly what part of auto insurance related to disability income, and it's wicked hard to do it for one province, so just trying to do it for 10 in a couple of territories is I leave that to some aspiring student to do that. But anyway, the ones that I'll talk about, as Alan's mentioned, CPP-D, EI sickness, veterans, private plans, workers' compensation. I've been asked by plan to include the RDSP. It's very, very small right now. I don't include it in the dollar amounts, although that's something that I'll be doing in further iterations of this. DTC, disability tax credits, and I will interchangeably be using the terms income assistance. Some provinces and territories call it IA, some call it social assistance, and shorten that to SA. But interchangeably throughout. And then finally, that portion of the working income tax benefit for people with disabilities, again, it's very small, but a part that I thought I should include in terms of those disability income systems in Canada. So if we go back to, I've only included in the analysis I've done over the years, and it's been about the last 10 years, disability income programs that you see here. And the reason I started in 2005, it really has no special meaning. 2005 is just when I started this work. Somewhere around 2007 I could get 2005 data, and so what you're going to see here today, instead of going from 2005 through to 2012, I now have the full set of 2013 data. So this is a first for me and a first for all of you. So back in 2005, we spent from various sources, and remember this isn't all government, it comes from various different funding sources. We had spent about $23.2 billion. At that time, the total of the income security system was about $125 billion, so it's somewhere around 18 to 19% of the total income security system in Canada. And you could see that even at that time, the social assistance benefits for persons with disabilities was the largest single component of the various income systems that we have. I'm fond of saying it's like 9 or 10 cats in a bag because of the way that they're administered and with the various different philosophies that Ellen's already talked to you about. So fast forward to 2013, and all of these programs all together, if you add up all the dollars spent in Canada, again from a variety of different funding sources, comes very close to $32 billion. The total amount of money spent on income security in Canada now, if you believe the Fraser Institute's figures, is about $180 billion. I would peg it closer to about $170 to $175 billion. And the reason for that is that that file that gives you the $180 billion is one that includes Canada Council grants. It includes all sorts of payments to individuals that we would not necessarily think of being part of the income security system. So when you see that $180 billion being used by former Senator Hugh Segal or by the Fraser Institute, it overestimates to a slight degree the money that actually goes, that's paid to individuals in Canada, but about 170 to 175 of that $180 billion is income security. So at $31.7 billion, disability income amounts paid to individuals is about 1.5% of Canada's GDP. So if we're looking at a roughly $2 trillion economy, the 31 is somewhere around 1.6% of GDP. But when we start to look under the hood, so to speak, we look at income support for persons with disabilities and looking at the percentage change. When we look overall across Canada, what we see is that social assistance is galloping forward. What the slide also says, so social assistance for persons with disabilities, it includes First Nation social assistance. We've included the AISH program in Alberta, which there is some discussion over whether it's really a social assistance program or a hybrid different program, but we included AISH and also the SED program in Saskatchewan, which again has elements that some might call not entirely a social assistance program. But if we take those from 2005 to 2013, they've increased by 51.5%. And if we take the total income support for persons with disabilities that includes social assistance, it's increased by 36.5%. So, in other words, social assistance is becoming a larger portion of the overall system. When we move over and look at the same graph in Ontario, and good news for all of you from different jurisdictions, I could basically do all of these, a suite of these slides for every jurisdiction. But in Ontario, you can see that it's accelerating even faster. What we see is rates of increase in social assistance disability payments that some believe to be epidemiologically impossible, and that's part of what we wanted to try to get at, why we're seeing such a large increase in social assistance. And in Ontario, of course, the total income support for persons with disabilities is just under 40%. So if we take key features of these 9 systems, there's an awful lot, again, going on under the hood. And when we look at whether a program requires employment for eligibility, when we know after the Great Recession of 2008-9, we know that fewer people with disabilities have been able to get regular full-time employment. We see that the Canada Pension Plan, for example, requires employment for eligibility. EI sickness does the same. For veterans, of course, it's military. Workers' safety and insurance boards, workers' compensation require employment, as do private workplace plans, the working income tax benefit. And you only have 2 smaller programs, the DTC, the disability tax credit, that doesn't necessarily require employment in order to get the benefits of the non-refundable deduction, and the RDSP, again, which is very small at present. So it leaves, in some ways, social assistance as the largest single program that does not require employment. And so that starts to tell you a little bit about why it would be increasing more than the other programs. And then if we look at a second question, which is permanent monthly benefits provided to age 65, in the case of Canada Pension Plan, of course, the answer is yes. But then we look at EI sickness, which we know only goes for 15 weeks. Veterans programs, and we all remember the video played over and over again of Mr. Fantino being followed down a hallway by a woman talking about asking for permanent disability benefits for her husband. And for veterans programs, they may get reinstated with the new government, but at the same time, one of the stories with veterans under the Veterans Charter is that people did not, veterans were not able to get permanent disability benefits. If we look over to workers' safety and insurance boards, workers' compensation, generally speaking, the rule has been much more towards 2 years of benefits and then you're out. And arguably, again, you have to look across the country in various different programs, but the various workers' compensation programs have been trying to get out of long-term up until age 65 type disability benefits. Private workplace plans, which are much, much more difficult to try and find out exactly what they're doing, and there's so many of them and they do so many different things. But clearly the rule was that people who became disabled in the workplace could get very long-term benefits in many cases. Some have annuities of various sorts, people that I've met certainly, right through to their 65th birthday. But the general rule now in private plans tends to be, again, a 24-month rule. So what does that do when you have a lot of large-scale benefits that used to provide long-term disability benefits and they stop doing it? Well, it's almost like that lineup where you ask for volunteers and everybody steps back, and then there's just one or two programs left, and in this case it's largely the social assistance program. And many of you will know that the Canada Pension Plan, for example, administratively has tightened up a lot in terms of the granting of disability benefits over the last few years. So in many ways it's put a great deal of pressure on social assistance as the program of last resort. In other words, there's consequences when other programs stop providing benefits to people. Then it's going to be much more pressure, a hydraulic pressure, if you will, almost on social assistance. So here's some examples here of income support for persons with disabilities and percentage change in estimated expenditures from 2005 to 2013. My understanding is we have people from Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, Ontario, BC in the room, so I just took these as selected ones. And what you'll see is that when we look at total social assistance for persons with disabilities, you'll see that in Ontario and BC and Canada overall, we're seeing a higher percentage increase. But interestingly, looking at the Quebec and East, you find that other programs have increased more than the social assistance side. So as I started into this research, it looked like overall that we were seeing a galloping trend towards greater amounts of social assistance being spent over the years. But if you look at especially Quebec and to the Atlantic provinces, the trend is actually a little different. So we have to start doing some detective work to find out why that is the case. So let's go to the per capita story by program. So if we take total assistance for persons with disabilities, what we might expect to find in the Canadian Federation is that the per capita amounts would actually be somewhat the same across the country. That has not turned out to be the case, and we see that especially in the Atlantic provinces and in Ontario, and maybe to a lesser extent to BC, we see that the much higher per capita amounts paid to persons with disabilities, and so we need to think about why something like that would happen. Of course, you have very different programs, but let's dig down a little more into that. One thing to do is to take the total assistance for persons with disabilities excluding income assistance, again, aka social assistance, aka income assistance, social assistance disability benefits. I mean, to use those terms interchangeably. And what you see is, especially in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, where you exclude income assistance per capita, you see much higher amounts, again, in the Atlantic provinces and maybe BC, and you see lower amounts in Ontario through to Alberta. So once again, this starts to get interesting. So what's really causing all of this? If we look at income assistance for persons with disabilities per capita, we see that Ontario is leading the way. It led the way in 2005 and is now leading the way, especially in 2013. Well, one thing that you might surmise, and there's a certain truth to it, is the whole idea that if you have a separate social assistance program that provides considerably higher benefits to people with disabilities with a different set of rules, then you are going to see a higher amount of money going to people with disabilities. For example, in Ontario, from 1995, when social assistance rates were cut by 21.6%, what you saw was a difference in the single rate of social assistance that was 78% apart. In other words, the amount somebody got for disability in the social assistance program was 78% higher than the welfare rate. And I think that was the highest difference in all of Canada. And in some, that's part of the story here, but it isn't the whole story. So let's move on to private disability insurance. And interestingly, we've been able to get this figure for the last 8 years, where we look at the private disability insurance in various different provinces. And as you can see, again, Nova Scotia is very high, which it tends to be per capita in all the programs, but you can see that Ontario's even a little bit higher there, and BC is also getting up towards $200 per capita in terms of disability insurance. And again, in most jurisdictions, I think, yes, in all of them, you see a higher amount in private disability insurance per capita over that 8-year period. Workers' compensation looks a little bit different, and perhaps if we had the data for 2014 and 2015, it would be even more stark. But you can see that the per capita amounts, especially in provinces like Alberta and Ontario, have actually moved down somewhat or stayed the same. But the rises in terms of workers' compensation benefits have been more modest, certainly, than in other programs. So let's get on to EI, and this EI is a real major part of this story. We're going to look at first at benefits to contribution, then EI ratio to employed by province, EI payments per capita by province, in other words, regular benefits, and then EI sickness payments per capita by province. There's no test on this afterwards. You just sort of, this is taking it all in, sort of statistics light. So if we look at a really interesting chart that I pulled off a presentation that's on the ESDC site, the Canadian site, and we look at adjusted regular benefits to contribution ratio and unemployment rate by province, you can see the really stark difference in terms of the regular benefits to contribution ratio and unemployment rates by province, where you see the real low ones are Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, to some extent BC, but then we look at the Atlantic provinces and we see much higher. And of course, there are really different programs in the Atlantic provinces versus the rest of Canada. If we look at the ratio of EI income recipients to employment income earners by province for Canada in 2013, once again you see a very different story when we look at Atlantic Canada and to some extent Quebec, and then look at Ontario and West. We really have two very, very different programs. Something that we all know, something that we've known for a long time, but it starts to, the EI program and its coverage starts to be invasive in terms of the overall story on disability incomes as we're coming to see. Look at EI payments per capita by province, and for Canada in 2013 we see the same sort of thing where we have much higher in the five eastern provinces versus the 5 western provinces. But certainly in Atlantic Canada, much higher EI payments per capita. What I found really interesting is that when we went to EI sickness per capita, and I guess I shouldn't have found it as interesting as I did, but we look at 2005 to 2013, and again, we see these very high per capita payments, even for EI sickness, especially in PEI, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, compared to the rest of Canada. So this really makes a difference in terms of the amount of people who go on to social assistance and then move from social assistance regular to a disability program. That same sort of movement doesn't appear to occur in the Atlantic provinces. Again, I'm speculating and trying to be provocative a bit, but at the same time, that's how it appears on the surface. CPP disability per capita. Again, one where you think, here's a program that's the same across Canada, but what we again see with even CPP disability per capita 2005 and 2013, that when we look at the Atlantic provinces, that we see a much higher per capita payment of CPP disability, which is very interesting in a program that is not supposed to be different between different provinces. Of course, Quebec has QPP, and that would be the one outlier here. Veterans pensions and awards per capita. Interesting again. Here's a program that's supposed to be the same all across the country, but we see much more higher per capita awards in Atlantic Canada, and it starts to explain why you don't see that same sort of that hydraulic movement, if you will, to having social assistance be racing ahead as it does in the 5 western provinces. You see that the mitigating influence of other disability programs shown here as a per capita basis shows why we don't see the same sort of movement in eastern Canada. So what I've come to call the whole idea of a much higher share of social assistance in disability programs as a percent. I've called that welfareization in a couple of papers that I've done. And so I wanted to tell you about the story of income assistance growth. What's really interesting, and I don't know, any of you who have done media interviews, when you do a media interview and somebody asks you the question, why are disability incomes, why are we seeing social assistance disability incomes going up by such an amount? Or why are we seeing the increases that we're seeing in disability incomes? And I start out by telling the person who interviews you before you go on air with some big star, whether that's on radio or TV, and I said, well, there's 20 main reasons. They look at you in horror. No, you're not going to be talking about 20 main reasons for it. And I said, but I'm sorry, there are 20 main reasons for this, and they're all correct. It's kind of like Murder on the Orient Express, you know, each one was a murder. So let's get into those for 7 or 8 minutes, and I'll just talk about some of those reasons. I got 14 answers why we're seeing increasing social assistance, and then 6 reasons why we're not seeing that in Atlantic Canada. So we have workforce changes whereby persons with disabilities and others do not have tenured salary and wage jobs that would trigger disability benefits. We all know about that. We have reductions in some of the other 8 disability income systems other than social assistance, which I've already talked about. Embedded rules that do not support work in older disability income programs like CPP-D. We know you can only, once you earn, about $6,000, then you become ineligible for CPP-D. Changes in medical treatment and especially advances in medicine and trauma treatment. Absolutely the case for the increases in disability benefits. Aging of the population, one of the most common one that's speculated on, and again it's true. The inclusion of mood disorders and neuroses as disabilities, the main one being PTSD. Of course, that's part of the reason. The supposed existence of a disability culture where people choose disability benefits over employment, I only included because it was included in the OECD report that gave Canada a clean bill of health, that wasn't happening here, but is apparently happening in Europe, Northern Europe, and within the EU. Existence, and if I have a very progressive audience, I can tell you I get boos whenever I say that one. Existence of separate social assistance disability programs and large differences in benefit levels, which I talked about earlier, that's also true. Another interesting one that started to arise is reductions in OAS and GIS for immigrant seniors. And then again, we have more immigrant seniors in Quebec, Ontario, and BC, and fewer in Atlantic Canada, and those that have much lesser OAS entitlements because they haven't been here for 40 years. We're starting to see them starting to collect the top-up from disability programs. The post-economic crash, unemployment among persons with disabilities, and continuing economic stagnation in that area, again, is another correct reason. Lack of knowledge about disability income systems other than social assistance amongst poor people, that's undoubtedly true. Post-recession differences in employment patterns and benefits, again, certainly if we look at cities, the major big cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, etc., those larger cities, Montreal, you see that irregular employment is much more the rule there than in other provinces. Differing financial incentives amongst programs to bring people back with disabilities back to work, we know that's true, and barriers to work in general. So let's go to 6 major reasons for the differences among provinces. In other words, why Ontario West we see this welfareization, and then Quebec East, we don't see it to the same degree. 6 reasons I'll give you. Huge differences in EI coverage that reduce the number of persons going on social assistance in eastern provinces. Undoubtedly true. As regular social assistance is often a precursor to application for disability benefits, more robust regular EI appears to reduce social assistance overall. See that throughout. Disability programs that are smaller, less generous, and not separate in eastern provinces, where you have an overall income assistance program and don't have a separate legislated disability component. That's a reason. Smaller social assistance-based disability components for First Nations in the eastern provinces. I certainly saw that amongst them, especially in Atlantic Canada. A greater portion of persons with disabilities in the mainstream wage and salary workforce is in eastern provinces. Even though we are seeing more precarious employment all across the country, it's more pronounced in larger cities, and we don't have those same larger cities in Atlantic Canada. Greater presence of interventions by other disability systems in eastern provinces. That was the per capita story that I showed you. Fewer persons with disabilities that are ineligible or eligible for reduced benefits for old age security. Fewer immigrants, fewer returning Canadians among that cadre, so we don't see that same influence there. So some conclusions. We have a shift of coverage and responsibility from employee-based disability income programs to the public purse through social assistance. And given the complexity of disability income assistance, they cannot be understood in isolation from each other. So what I've tried to do is use a different denominator. So let's look at those 9 or 10 disability income systems and use that as our denominator for study. And of course the programs have widely varying purposes and tend to collide with each other all the time. They vary widely on the issue of workforce participation because of their underlying philosophies. And social assistance as a system that encourages work is often stymied by other disability income systems, just as social assistance with its destitution model tends to stymie the efforts of other programs. And social assistance growth based on many factors, but labor market change is very, very important, possibly one of the most important single reason. And then changing income assistance criteria won't reduce costs of numbers, as reasons for growth are largely extraneous to social assistance. This is really one of my main messages to governments, is that if you think you can go into social assistance disability programs and then start tightening up the rules, and that's really going to take your expenditures down. If you have all these other programs that are withdrawing their and tightening up their eligibility at the same time, you're going to have a hard time doing it with social assistance, because social assistance is the last payer. All those people that are being taken off other programs are coming down to social assistance. So tightening it up at the back door is not going to work. Thank you.